Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. According to the World Health Organization, every year 1.3 million people die globally due to road accidents. The UN also states that road accidents are the 8th leading cause of death for people of all ages. In light of this, 40 countries, including Japan and the European Union, have agreed on a UN regulation draft for advanced emergency braking systems for new cars and commercial vehicles from early 2020. On tonight's show, we'll discuss what measures need to be taken in order for this regulation to be effective. We also try to explore how road accidents can be prevented in increasingly populous and busy streets. Joining us to discuss this is Amit Bhatt, who is the Director of Integrated Urban Transport and World Resource India. Also joining us is Dario Hidalgo, who is the Executive Director of Fundación Despacio. And with us in the studios is Ali Laghari, who's in charge Control CTP. Thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Dario, I'd like to begin with you. When we're talking about urban planning, cities being developed and designed, how much of a priority are city planners giving to minimizing road accidents?
Very unfortunately, city planners are designing cities mostly for cars and not necessarily for people. And that creates a big risk. Most of the people dying in traffic accidents is people outside the cars. So we have pedestrians, we have motorcyclists, and we have cyclists that are unfortunately dying due to high speeds at which roads in urban environments are designed right now. We need to design cities differently. We need to design cities more for people than for cars.
Yes. And can you tell us exactly how streets are pedestrian unfriendly? Describe to us the extent of this.
Well, making the roads in an urban environment very wide, it's totally unfriendly. The vehicles are able then to speed up to high speed, and when a person is hit by a car over 50 kilometers an hour, only has a 15% chance of surviving the crash. So, and then there's also the turning radius. It's very, very wide, and the vehicles are able to turn at high speed. And when they hit a cyclist, the cyclist is very likely to die if the speed is higher than these 50 kilometers an hour. In urban environments, streets need to be designed for that speed because there's this opportunity of having the interaction with people that is not able to handle the energy that a heavy vehicle has.
Yes. And Mr. Dario, you mentioned here how the most vulnerable population are those who are not in the cars, motorcyclists and pedestrians. And with that, I want to ask Amit, when we're talking about rules and regulations and laws regarding related to that are being developed, how are these groups of people, pedestrians, motorcyclists, marginalized within safety laws?
I mean, if you look at some of the laws in developing countries, there's virtually no law which kind of takes care of the safety of pedestrians, cyclists, or other vulnerable road users, right? So, I mean, I'll take an example of Delhi, where I'm currently sitting. So the city records around 1,500 to 1,600 deaths every year due to road traffic crashes. And the reason why I'm not using the word accident is because I believe, and the road safety fraternity believes, that these are very much preventable. So it's not an accident which is something which is beyond our control. So I'll use the word crash. And out of this 1,500, almost 50% are pedestrians.
Yeah.
Now the question is, why is this happening? Now, there are two fundamental problems with which we design our infrastructure. So if you look at highways are designed to move vehicles. But roads inside the cities are designed or should be designed to move people. But what we do, we typically copy-paste the highway design into the city streets. And then these crashes happen. So one is that we have to design streets in a manner which can take care of all the users, pedestrians, cyclists, two-wheelers, as well as people who are on motorized modes of transport like cars and buses and others.
And what's that number one thing that is needed to be kept in mind while we're designing these streets for them to be friendly to those who are not in cars? What should be kept in mind?
So the first and the fundamental thing that we need to do is design with respect to safe speed. So I'll give you a statistics. So if a pedestrian is hit by a car which is at 30 kilometers per hour, the chances of survival is 85%. If the same car hits the pedestrian at 50 kilometers per hour, the chances of survival reduces to 15%. So we have to design our roads for safe speeds. If you're going to design roads for 80, 90, 100 kilometers per hour in our city, we are designing to kill people. So that's number one. Number two, we should look at how we can better manage the crossing of streets. And I believe, the world of road safety science believe, in most cases, we cannot put foot over bridges or underpasses. It has to be at grade, but safe at grade crossing. And third, design streets for all users, not only users, people who are driving cars.
Yes. Definitely. And Amit, you mentioned here how the speed is the key factor here. And with that, I want to move on to Mr. Ali Laghari here. So when we're talking about speed regulation, of course, there are many laws, there are many boards that determine what speed cars should drive at. But how well are these implemented, and how much of a civic sense needs to be developed in individuals for them to abide by these speed limits?
Exactly. Thank you for the opportunity. I just want to say in this regards, like the speed limits are there and we need to comply according to the traffic rules and regulations, but the basic thing is our attitudes, right? And see, if there's a law that if you are drunk and you cannot drive, and if you disobey the law, that means the accidents are going to give up. And secondly, as in context to Mr. Amit's figures for what he said related to
speed.
For the speed matters, like the road engineering and infrastructure is to be in a way, it is designed to be in a way to keep the speed limits in mind.
So, and when you're designing these regulations for the speed limits to be kept in mind, how widely should they be implemented, and how much checking is necessary there?
Exactly, they have to do the road tests first, and the experts, they have to give their opinion. There's specifically a department which needs to work for it.
Okay. And Mr. Dario, moving on to you, when we're talking about policies being developed, and of course we're seeing how laws already in place are not taking into account pedestrians and motorcyclists, how important is it for policymakers to have engagement with these groups of people in order to make sure that the policies developed are geared towards catering to them?
Yes, well, the need for engagement is there. Unfortunately, the voices of most of the road users are not heard. Most of the road users in our cities in the global south are still pedestrians, but the roads are not designed for pedestrians. So how to bring the pedestrians into the conversation, it's something that engineers and planners and decision makers that usually are not necessarily pedestrians themselves on an everyday basis need to take into account. It's very, very important to follow some of the big recommendations from several organizations around the world, starting by the World Health Organization, which keeps these statistics, but is also giving guidance to the different countries around the world on how to make things better. We had extraordinary examples around the world in the OECD countries that have adopted a vision that is geared towards zero deaths in roads in their countries. And even our infrastructure is so different from the infrastructure in countries in Europe or in Northern North America. We are able to design roads in a way that is for our conditions, for the conditions where we have so many motorcycles and so many people walking. The idea is to reduce the speeds, have this maximum that Amit Bhatt is telling in urban environments of 50 kilometers an hour, but not just do the design. It's very important also to have enforcement. There's few people that even if the design is right, doesn't follow these regulations. So we need particularly the support of the police and the support of technology. Right now, there is available technology to control the speeds and to be able to do ticketing of speeding. And this technology is no longer that expensive, and it's much easier than having a larger police body.
Yes, and since you mentioned technology here, I want to ask Amit to opinion on what needs to be done in terms of technology to integrate it in order to make driving and speed more safe and regulated.
So as Dr. Hidalgo said, technology is now available and it is cheap.
Yeah.
The question is, are we using the technology? So for example, virtually everyone has a cell phone. Can we integrate cell phone to driving? We can easily calculate speed. That's number one. Number two, we now have speed detection cameras which are very available in a very low cost, but we are still not deploying them. And wherever we are deploying, we are not using it for enforcement of speed. We are using it for other purposes like security and other. So right now, as Dr. Hidalgo said, technology is available, but the big missing piece, at least in some of the cities and countries I have been to, is the political will. People are still not willing to kind of take the people who are driving cars to ask them, to force them to slow down speed. So
Why
that is number
that?
one. I think a lot of it because a lot of these movers and shakers of the city, the decision makers, the people who are higher up ladder in the economic strata, use cars. And so for them, if you challan them or if you should issue them ticket, they feel otherwise. But I have to ask them, is waiting 2 minutes or 3 minutes intersection that big a problem than, let us say, killing 50% pedestrians in the city? And that is what we have to ask them. What is more important, life of a human being or 5 or 10 minutes of these people?
Yes, definitely. Yes. And with that, I want to ask Mr. Ali here, how important is finding those individuals who are breaking the law hefty fines in order to deter these accidents, in order to deter people from breaking the law? Or does that even work? Or is it futile?
I would say, first I would add here that from the enforcement point of view, the cameras are capturing like close to 290,000 violations in a day.
Wow.
Right? And out of that, it's like 40,000, close to 40,000 violations are due to speed limits. So if we target this and we check out, mainly we could find people who do least compliance towards the traffic laws, and secondly, in this matter, the juvenile drivers their attitudes towards driving is like more irresponsible.
And when we're talking about juvenile drivers here, of course, in many countries, the age of when your license is permitted varies. But what needs to be that one standard that underlines all these processes and makes sure that the juvenile drivers who are receiving their license are responsible enough? What is that one thing, key factor in perhaps a test that needs to be implemented?
Firstly, I think they should go through a proper driving license classes. They have to follow a curriculum before they apply for a driving license, and if they are successful in their mock sessions, they drive through the simulators, and once they got cleared through that, and then they can go forward to apply for a driving license.
And Mr. Amit, while we were talking about technology here, of course, one thing that comes up is how distracted driving is increasing day by day because of technology. What needs to be done to ensure that while you're integrating more and more technology within your cars, it doesn't become a distraction? Customized cars don't become a distraction.
So while on one side we are seeing the benefits of technology, we are also seeing the disbenefits of technology coming in.
Yeah.
So there are a few things which we can do to kind of address this. One is, and again, I'm just repeating one more time, we have to manage speed in our urban areas. If you are able to control speed, we can reduce these fatal accidents into simple accidents. So maybe a person will be injured, but he will not die. So that's point number one. Point number two, there are also technologies which are evolving, which kind of map the iris of the, so for example, if you look at the new Tesla cars which have come in the US, and if you put them on auto drive mode,
Yeah.
It senses that you are touching the steering every 1 minute. If not, then the auto driver goes off. So there are also technologies which look at your iris movement, your overall movement in the city, in the car, so that they can sense if you are asleep or half asleep, and they can respond. So there are still technologies coming. We have to start looking at adopting them. But for me, the biggest gain, if I were to ask one major step that would save life, bringing cities to a safe speed will save a lot of lives.
Yes. Okay, and I take that point over there, but we're also joined by Kahl, who's an editor-in-chief of the Automotive World. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin, when we're talking about this report, explain to us exactly what the UN resolution entails when it says that they're going to implement advanced emergency braking systems.
This technology is important because the ruling is important because for the first time it means that countries are requiring the adoption of the technology. Up till now, vehicle manufacturers have often skirted around the small print in local regulations by saying that they meet technology requirements required in that particular country.
Yeah.
By having this ruling, it means that the countries now require the technology. And this technology is, it's been proven, according to global NCAP, AEB technology cuts rear-world rear-end crashes by 38%. This is a significant advance for the automotive industry and for consumers.
Yes, and related to that point, Mr. Martin, we have witnessed in the past many times that automobile companies have to recall the automobiles left out on the market because they did not meet a specific standard or there was a huge, grave manufacturing default within them. So related to that, I want to ask you, which standard are automobile companies actually following in order to ensure that these callbacks don't even have to happen? We've seen that with Toyota, we've seen that with Ford, many mainstream companies here.
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish between introducing a ruling like this, which requires that a technology is fitted, and any manufacturing defects that might lead to a callback, as you referred to there. Those are usually down to poor oversight at the point of manufacturing and not relating to the regulation. So regulation like this, I think it's important to focus on the fact that the vehicle manufacturers are required to fit this technology in all of the markets which have signed up to this draft regulation or will sign this regulation.
Yeah. And many countries, almost 50 countries have signed on to this regulation, but of course it was noticeable that China and the United States had not signed to this regulation. And since they are big players in the automobile manufacturing industry, what impact does that have on the overall success of this regulation?
It will be interesting to see how that develops. It's important to note that just because a country has not signed up to this regulation or will not sign up, I think the signing takes place in June, just because the country does not sign up doesn't mean that vehicle manufacturers are not fitting the technology. In Europe, the technology has been part of Euro NCAP testing since 2013. Japan NCAP introduced AEB testing in 2014. It's been part of the China NCAP testing since 2018. And in the US, 20 vehicle manufacturers have already agreed to introduce the technology on a voluntary basis across most of their model ranges by 2021, I believe. 2022, in fact.
And this discrepancy that's going to exist in the market in terms of the older models that are already out in the streets and the newer models, what can be done to counter that? Because this regulation will, of course, only apply to the newer models, but there's going to be many unsafe cars out on the streets. What can be done about that?
That's absolutely right. It's not possible to retrofit this technology, so it will be a case of as those vehicles end their lives, they will come off the road, and more new vehicles will have the technology on. Other than banning those vehicles because they don't have the technology, which would be quite a drastic thing for any country to do, I don't see anything other than natural wastage, as it were, being the thing that brings those vehicles out of the market. But it's an interesting question, because even if you speak to organizations such as Euro NCAP, I've had this conversation with the Secretary General of Euro NCAP, market pull versus regulatory push is the thing that all of these vehicle manufacturers and the countries have to deal with. They have to decide what's more important. Introducing a ruling, which by the time that ruling comes into force may be talking about technology that's now outdated, versus market pull, where consumers desire safer vehicles and therefore they opt for those which have technologies such as AEB fitted.
Yes, and that is something that policymakers and lawmakers need to grapple with. But before we move on to that into depth, I'd like to ask Mr. Dario on this point of what lawmakers and policymakers need to do. A report issued in America stated that because of SUVs and a rise in SUVs, the fatality of accidents amongst pedestrians increased. So in this regard, do you think that lawmakers and policymakers also should keep in mind the types of vehicles on the roads? And if they're becoming more dangerous, there should be a cap on them?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult to cap particular kinds of vehicles. It is very important to include the regulations that are for safer vehicles on them. And this is what the United Nations and the agreements are pushing towards.
Okay, Mr. Dario, hold on to that thought. I also want to bring Amit into this. Amit, on the on that point, same point, what can you tell us?
So yes, so as Dario said, that it will be difficult to kind of ban a particular kind of vehicle, but we have a taxation structure through which we can incentivize or disincentivize vehicles. For example, if you have a higher taxes on SUVs, in an indirect manner, you can slow down the growth of SUVs. So we can look at taxation to incentivize or disincentivize structure, a particular type of vehicle, and then we can kind of advance certain vehicle in certain geographies and restrict certain vehicle in certain geographies.
And Amit, something that you mentioned previously in relation to high speed was city planning and how streets need to be designed in that way. And what is that? Can you tell us exactly in terms of architecture and landscape, how do streets need to be designed in order to make sure that they are compatible with high speeds, with different types of speeds?
So the first thing that we should change, so typically if you look at street design, what happens is that we design streets for 80, 100 kilometers per hour and then put a speed limit of, let us say, 50 kilometers per hour. Now that will not work, because once you design something for 80 or 100, and if there is lack of enforcement, people will drive at 100 or 120.
Yeah.
So one way to reduce this speed is if you design it slower. The question then becomes, how do you design slower speeds? One, you can reduce the width of the lane. So instead of having 3.5 meter wide one lane, you can reduce it to 3 meter one lane. So that's one. Secondly, you can introduce intersections to slow down the speed. You can also do something called a road safety audit of a street and find what is the safety problem and retrofit the street with safer elements.
And Amit, what is the solution to cities that are older, that are not yet, that have been developed for quite some time and have these issues and are not working alongside the population growth? What's the solution to that, if there is any?
Solution to me is of two types. If you have width, then you can segregate, let us say, a motorized traffic with a non-motorized traffic, which is sidewalks, cycle tracks. That is if you have space. If you don't have space, then you have to develop streets in shared manner, which typically means slowing down the overall traffic so that everyone can coexist.
Yeah. Amit, with that, I want to ask Martin here, with this resolution of safety that has been passed and has been signed on, to what needs to happen at the legislative end now in order to ensure that whatever has been written there is actually adhered to?
Well, any country which demands that AEB is fitted, those vehicles will not be legal. In any car that doesn't have that technology fitted will not be legal and will not be able to be sold in that market.
Yeah. And can you also tell us more about that technology there? Fitting is one thing, but how does it in fact work? And if it fails, does that mean that the risk of an accident is increased?
The technology, well, the basic version of AEB is camera or radar based, sometimes with stereo cameras, sometimes a mix of camera and radar, and it will stop the vehicle if the vehicle identifies that it is about to hit the car in front. And it's a very unpleasant experience. It's very, very jarring, very sudden, but it will stop the car within millimeters of the vehicle in front. There are advances on AEB technology, AEB 2, 2+, and so on, which enable the car to identify pedestrians in the dark, for example, pedestrians stepping into the path of a turning car, for example. There are other technologies that will identify cyclists and will identify animals. But all of this needs to be using technology which can identify the motion of a particular object and be able to identify the difference between the side of a car that's going past and a cyclist, for example. Some of these technologies are already being tested, for example, by Euro NCAP, where you can receive additional points which count towards a star rating, which might then help you to go from 4 stars to 4.5 or 5 stars. These are not mandatory technologies. These are part of a broader testing program to try and encourage vehicle manufacturers to attach as much or to install as much technology as possible on the car. As to whether it might fail or not, that is nothing to do with this regulation. This regulation calls for that technology to be technology which works and works every time.
And do you think that this was a much needed resolution in that regard, regardless of whether or not that technology fails or not?
I think it is, because there was a time when certain vehicle manufacturers were promoting how safe their vehicles were. In Europe, for example, yet they were selling equivalent vehicles in emerging markets where this technology was not required, and therefore they were leaving AEB, for example, off those vehicles being sold in those markets. Had that been installed on those cars would have been more expensive. Perhaps they would not have been able to sell those cars, but the people who bought them would have had then that technology on the car, and it might have had a different outcome in a crash that they may have had.
And Martin, since you mentioned the expense here, how expensive will it make automobiles in the future if this technology is installed? Will there be a significant difference? And if there is a difference, will it just counter the complete process of introducing these, because people will want to revert back to older models?
If you want to buy a new car, you will have to buy a car with AEB fitted. So the question of whether you have a choice between a car with AEB or without will no longer be an issue. And that's part of the question between market pull versus regulatory push. As for how much the technology costs, I'm not able to tell you that. I don't know. The more that companies can benefit from economies of scale, the more they can bring that technology price down, and they can factor that into the overall cost of the vehicle, rather than people being aware that they're paying a few hundred or many hundred more dollars or whatever for their vehicle.
Thank you so much, Martin Kahl, for joining us. Now we're joined by Francois Guichard, who is a mechanical engineer at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and also joined by Syed Daniyal Hasni, who's an automobile expert. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Francois, let me first start off with you. What does this UN resolution entail exactly?
This is a regulation which is adopted in the framework of a multilateral agreement, which is defining technical provisions for safety systems which are installed in vehicles. It means in order to sell a vehicle in some countries, there will be a request for compliance with these requirements. And in short, it means that these vehicles will have to be equipped with some systems to help preventing crashes with pedestrians, cars, and later with bicycles. This is the conclusion of some works of research. We are in the context of automated driving, autonomous driving. There is research ongoing, and actually some byproduct of this research can be applied at low cost to normal vehicles. There are variations between countries, but the United States of America are very often present in these activities. This time in January, unfortunately for national reasons, they were not able to attend and to work with us and to contribute to the work, but this was exceptional. Usually the USA is participating to our activities.
Mr. Daniyal, so when we're talking about advanced emergency brake systems, what can you tell us about how they operate and how they can be installed within cars?
Actually, this is also known as a collision avoidance system, or you can say pre-crash system. And it works in a way like once an impending collision is detected, these systems provide a warning to the driver. When the collision becomes imminent, they take action autonomously without any driver input. So either they use braking or steering or both. So this avoids the collision by braking appropriately at low vehicle speeds. This system is known as, it is a radar, we call it radar. And after every 6 months, if the owner just has to go through these sensors, they should check the sensors, and these sensors are checked by the computer. And otherwise, braking pads, and it's just normal service. And this is a very, very, I can say that, easy process. And first of all, this whole system is life-saving for the pedestrians as well as for the other people on the roads and the passengers of the car.
Mr. Ali, I'd like to talk about more of the civic sense aspect. And when we're talking about licenses, giving licenses, but also the process of renewing them, what needs to be accounted for during that process?
Well, it should be like we have to keep a track. We need to keep a track for the period that the driver is driving, the attitude, the way he drives, and the most frequent violation that he commits, and we need to track that. And when it comes for a renewal, so we need to introduce a point system like we have in the western part of the world.
And how important is the factor of age when you're renewing a license? Because of course, with greater age comes weaker memory, weaker reflexes, weaker eyesight. So what needs to be done about that? In Japan, there has been a regulation that has made sure that those individuals who are elderly and who suffer from dementia are tested through, and to make sure that they do not get a license. So what needs to be done in that regard?
Same is the situation here. If they're like at a certain age where they feel ambiguity while driving at maybe the night time or in the daytime, dementia or something is happening with them. So they need to go through a proper medical test, and if they qualifies that, then they can proceed. Otherwise, I don't feel like they should be issued a valid driving license for driving.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. We're going to take a short break, but when we return, we're going to have another story for you. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Indus Special. In many ways, transportation systems are the lifeblood of a city's economy and social welfare. Yet the UN estimates that nearly 1 billion people worldwide still lack adequate access to road networks. This deprives countries of people with their access to basic necessities and services. Poor transportation systems translate into grave social inequalities. But what can and must be done to make sure that public transport systems are strengthened, not only for more people, but also in a sustainable manner? Let's continue our conversation with our guests. Mr. Ali, so when we're talking about public transportation here, of course, one thing is how important they are to a city, to a country, but also another factor that arises is how safe they are for the people who are using them. How must that be ensured?
As I would like to add, public transport is like much more safer as compared to individual driving, and it's equally important to the both aspects. Like it holds good for the economy and for the accident prevention. It plays a dual role in it.
Yeah. And when we're talking about the transport for specifically certain communities, certain groups, women and girls specifically, for public transportation to be used by them in a safe manner, what needs to be done there?
We have to ensure the bus stops especially or any train stations near the colleges and universities and educational institutes and other like social points, so that we can transport passengers to their destinations.
Okay. And one part of safe transportation that we need to keep in mind is ensuring that it also becomes more sustainable for the environment. And with that, Amit, I'd like to ask you, when we're developing public transportation and we're increasing its use, how do we make sure that it's sustainable for the future?
I think sustainability, we have to look at multiple dimensions, right? So one of the big issues of sustainability is environmental sustainability. Now, we know that instead of driving individual vehicle, if you shift to public transport, you would be emitting less greenhouse gases or less particulate matter, which is now a big problem in some of these Asian countries. So one is promoting public transport so that individual transport is not favored and people use public transport. The second is, how can we even more make public transport better? So for example, can we get cleaner vehicles? Can we get cleaner fuels? Right now there's a big debate happening around electric mobility. Now the moment you have electric buses, you remove all the tailpipe emission, which is a big source of kind of emission in the city. So that's environmental side. But there are also social issues. For example, what's the price of public transport? If the public transport price is more than a private transport, say two-wheelers, then people will not use public transport. So pricing is also important.
Yeah.
And third, which is very important, how do you disincentivize private transport? And that becomes very tricky, because the moment you have taxes, higher taxes on individual transport, then people kind of, who are rich and powerful, come up. So for example, parking. Most of the cities in developing countries give free parking. Why should you give free parking? You can tax private transport to fund your public transport expansion, which is what cities should do.
Yes. Okay, so Mr. Ali, here Amit also mentioned if public transportation is more expensive than private transportation, it will not provide an incentive for people to use it. So what needs to be done on that aspect? What needs to be done to make sure that public transportation is affordable?
We need to ensure that there are fare lists, and they have to be like up to a certain level, which the policymakers have just ensured on that. So we need to just make a counter check.
Okay. And Amit, a lot of what is arising out of this debate of transportation being affordable, public transportation being affordable in the developed countries is something that's coming up is the Green Deal that is being proposed in the Senate right now. Also in Luxembourg, public transportation has been made free. What are your thoughts on that?
So I mean, the moment you have a right pricing strategy for public transport, it will do wonders. I mean, you can see the difference in our cities. One thing we have to remember is that developing countries, be it Pakistan, India, or some of the other countries, still the transport demand is not there because a lot of people can't afford private transport. And when the public transport is not there, there is no opportunity for them. So they lack access to opportunities.
Yeah.
The moment you bring in high quality public transport, you actually mainstream a lot of people into the workforce. So we also have to see that are we providing opportunity, access to opportunity to the entire spectrum of the society. That can only be done if we have good, reliable, convenient, safe, and cost-effective public transport. Now, a lot of times our policymakers says, but we don't have money. The question is, you have money to build roads, but you don't expect car user to pay you back the road construction. You offer him parking which is free. Now, why can't we tax private transport and use that money to really develop good quality public transport in our cities?
And Amit, here, of course, if you're taxing private transportation, there will be a lash, there will be a pushback from the other side, because those individuals will also state that they have a right to private transportation if they can afford it. So how do we respond to that?
Exactly. So the way some of the cities have done is to find what is the true cost of a public transport or of any mode of transport. So for example, if a private transport does congestion, it has to pay a congestion fee. If the private transport does emission, it has to pay emission fee. And you can calculate true cost of transport. Whatever is the true cost, let's give it to the respective mode of transport so that it is equal and fair. And also remember, China, which is the big car manufacturer, it exports cars to most of the countries across the world. Some of these cities, whether it is Shanghai or Beijing, have put a cap that you can't go beyond this many cars because there is no room to accommodate this car. So we have to look at how do we restrict private transport sooner rather than later.
Okay, so Amit, here, while we're talking about restricting private transportation, so it causes an increase in the use of public transportation, one thing that policymakers also need to keep in mind is the quality of this public transportation so that it doesn't just become something that is there but and is not being used. So what needs to be done on that end? Because we do know, hearing from reports all around the world, many people feel unsafe using public transportation. If it's not efficient, the coming on timely routines and schedules, then it's futile to use. So what needs to be done at the policy end there?
I think there are two things which we need to figure out. One, public transport does not mean you pack people in a bus or a train like you pack animals. So there has to be a good quality, and quality has to be monitored. So that's point number one. Point number two, there is also a big rise in shared mobility. So for example, Uber, Lyft, all those models are also coming. So can we look at them as a substitute to private transport so that because you don't require space to park vehicle, and the same vehicle can kind of cater to multiple trips. So this development is also happening. The shared mobility is now coming up in a big way. We can also leverage them to augment and complement the public transport that we have in our cities.
Yeah. Ali, I'll put my last question to you here. When we're talking about regulating public transportation, what is the role of law enforcement individuals? What do they need to do in order to make sure public transportation is working smoothly, is safe?
Government should, the departments should ensure a periodic maintenance for these vehicles. There should be a legislation according to which they need to check the fitness of a vehicle. And for a public transport, as it is more eco-friendly, also economical, also it's a complete solution to all the needs of a road user, all the passengers. So there should be a legislation, and the departments should ensure the fitnesses of the vehicle.
Yes, and of course fitness is a necessity here, because if they're not safe vehicles, that will just lead to greater problems. Thank you so much, Mr. Ali, for joining us. Thank you so much, Mr. Amit, for joining us, Mr. Dario for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We'll see you again next week. Take care.